It is 2025 now, and geopolitics is crazy as ever, with the Russia-Ukrainian war looking like it's coming to an end, Trump trying to form Greater America like a toy for formable, and China once again saying it's going to invade Taiwan. We often hear a lot about China making moves on Taiwan nowadays, but the two sides never really started killing each other, right? Well, no. And I know what you're probably thinking. Oh yeah, they fought each other in the Chinese Civil War. Well, yes, you would be right, but that was nationalist China versus the PRC, back when they actually still held power in the mainland. What I'm focusing on is Taiwan versus the PRC, and while yes, nationalist China and Taiwan are technically the same political entity, but come on. Throughout this video, I will be using the term ROC for this and PRC for this, because those are the official names. So without further ado, let's get into the Taiwan Strait crises. This conflict was in the midst of the Cold War, so you did have your average Cold War shenanigans, your Soviet versus American proxies, your violent political repression, your nuclear threats, just average. But something unique about this conflict was that it wasn't the first clash between these two, unlike other East Asian Cold War era conflicts. They had been fighting on and off since 1927. In fact, they actually started off as allies, forced together by the Soviets in the First United Front. Anywho, it was a shaky alliance from the start, and after the Kuomintang had united China after a northern expedition, they started purging thousands of communists. This would mark the end of the First United Front and the start of the Chinese Civil War. Long story short, the communists were about to get destroyed, and they did a big retreat to reorganize. Then the Japanese Empire attacked, and the ROC was too busy fighting the communists to care. Eventually, the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek was put under house arrest by his own students from 10 years earlier to try and organize the Second United Front. Chiang eventually agreed that the communists could fight with the nationalists against the Japanese, but he was in control. The communists didn't really do much of the conventional fighting, but were behind the front lines disrupting Japanese supplies, among other guerrilla stuff. On the nationalist side, they had their moments, but they also had their blunders, and oh god, they had their blunders. Short and long story even shorter, the United Front eventually fought back against the Japanese with significant aid from the Allies and were able to push them back. The war ended with nationalist China holding much of the country from East Turkestan to Taiwan, and the communists having Manchuria as a gift from Stalin. But since the nationalists were the ones doing most of the fighting, they were significantly weakened, and the communists were significantly stronger. As the Civil War started up again, Chiang could see that it was practically unwinnable at this point, so he initiated a massive nationalist retreat to Taiwan, and the rest of the country fell to the communists. Except a bit. For a little bit. So, after the war, the communists did your average communist stuff, and the nationalists did your average nationalist stuff for the first few years before switching up to building up the economy, of course, with severe political repression sprinkled on top. And right when they were starting to develop the economy, the PRC attacked, starting the first Taiwan Strait crisis. On August 11th, 1954, upon a declaration that, quote, Taiwan must be liberated, PLA forces began the shelling of the Kinmen and Matsu archipelagos. The risk of U.S. involvement was only heightened by the killing of 2 U.S. military advisors. Not wanting to further anger the Americans, the PRC put a halt in their plans of attacking the Jiangshan Islands due to American soldiers conducting a military exercise there. The islands were later taken in 1955 after a quite impressive defense by ROC soldiers, despite the islands not having much strategic value. It was more about psychological warfare than anything else, as in the words of Chiang Kai-shek himself, guarding the Jiangshan for a day will raise the spirits of people in Taiwan. Guarding it for 2 days will strike terror into the Chinese communists, and guarding it for 3 days will reverse the attitude of the White House. They guarded the islands for about 61 hours. Not quite 3 days, but still impressive considering the numbers. The commander in charge of the soldiers contacted a nearby ROC army base via radio, telling them that the enemy was closing in and that he had a grenade in his hand saved for himself. The battle ended in defeat, but the political goals were achieved. Over in the US, the Formosa Resolution was passed, authorizing Eisenhower to defend Taiwan, quote, as he deems necessary. So basically, it let him defend Taiwan with anything, even nukes. The US actually threatened a nuclear strike multiple times, threatening to, quote, destroy Red China's military potential. And the crazier part was that they could actually do it, because they had significantly more nuclear weapons than the USSR at the time. If I had a penny for every time that the US threatened to nuke China in the first half of the 1950s during a civil conflict between a Soviet and US-backed nation, I'd have 2 pennies, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Get it? I made a funny joke. Laugh. Thankfully, the US never got the opportunity to put this plan into action, as the conflict ended shortly after ROC evacuated from the Dachan Islands. At the Afro-Asian Conference, Zhao Enlai stated the PRC's intent to negotiate with the US, defusing the first Taiwan Strait crisis. This was more of a continuation of the first Taiwan Strait crisis, as the PRC just began shelling the islands again. They did also try to land on Dongdang Island, but were repelled. That was the only actual attempt to take any land in the conflict, and the rest was mostly fought in the sky and on the sea. The main issue ROC faced was resupplying their army bases, which were under constant shelling. The Americans jumped to the nuclear option right away this time, but they decided that they would use conventional forces in the beginning. By September, the US had authorized naval escorts to help the ROC get supplies to Kinmen, and Eisenhower once again sent in the 7th, along with a ton of planes. The Soviets were not happy about this, so they told the Americans to stop threatening nuclear war, which the Americans promptly disregarded. Since the PRC didn't want war with America, they would refrain from shelling supplies carried by American convoys. This basically ended the shelling, but multiple air battles would still take place. Speaking of air battles, this video is sponsored by I'm kidding. I don't have any sponsors yet, but you could do to help me get sponsors possibly in the future. You could smash that. Okay. I don't know what you do YouTube thing, but hit the like button and sorry, so like I feel like saying this, but hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and comments, hairbrush. If you need to start recording in the bathroom, comment hairbrush channel, comments. Video. Anyways, back to the actual air battles. The US equipped the ROC Air Force with AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. This gave them a massive advantage over the PLA Air Force, resulting in numbers like these. This did have a downside for the West though, as on one occasion the missile just lodged from the side of the aircraft without exploding. This let the Soviets re-engineer it into the K-13. The Americans also sent the ROC a few M115 howitzer artillery pieces, which let them get on a more even playing field with the PRC. So remember how I said that the shelling ended? Well, not really. They continued shelling each other until 1979. Of course, it wasn't bad. It was just a few shells here and there, but still, that's kind of insane. So those were the 2 actually important ones where people actually died and there was an actual conflict, but technically there are 2 more, so I'm gonna condense those into one segment. Yeah, there were 2 other ones, but they really weren't important. Here's a quick overview. So, the president of the ROC visited the US, and the PRC wasn't very happy about that. In response to the visit, the PRC started launching missiles at the ROC. They were more of a warning than anything else, and they weren't intended to actually hit anything. They were basically just reminding the ROC that they can invade them at any time. Also, conducting naval and air exercises. In response to the response, the US also started flexing its military, sending in a few big ships. This went on until 1996, and basically nothing happened. People were afraid that the PRC would try to invade a few small islands, but that never happened. You may actually recognize the floor of Taiwan's trade crisis, as it happened pretty recently. For those of you who don't remember, it was when Nancy Pelosi visited ROC and then the PRC did a few military exercises around ROC airspace. In my opinion, the best thing to come out of this quote-unquote crisis was this clip.
Station calling U.S. military aircraft. Please identify yourself.
This is the Chinese Navy. This is the Chinese Navy. This is the Chinese Terror Sky. Please go away quickly in order to run judgment.
I am a United States military aircraft conducting lawful military activities outside national airspace. I am operating with due regard as required under international law.
Yep, those were the Taiwan Strait crises, the ones that mattered and the ones that didn't. So in conclusion, those were some pretty interesting geopolitical events, and with all things in the Cold War, almost resulted in nuclear Armageddon. More than once. Let's just hope that there isn't a fifth, but with the PRC making its New Year's resolution to retake Taiwan almost every year, that doesn't seem really likely. But, like every time Kim Jong-un says he's gonna blow up the West, the PRC never really acts on these promises, at most just flying some planes around the island. In conclusion, I might not be able to visit China after this video, but let me make it clear that I had no intention of smearing the glorious People's Republic of China in any way, and this video was purely for educational purposes. Please don't ban me, YouTube. By September, the U.S. had authorized naval exports. By September, the U.S. had authorized naval escorts to help the ROC get supplies and... By September, the U.S. had authorized naval... God damn it, I sound like a... By September, the U.S. had authorized naval escorts...